Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
And if y'all have any questions, those of you kind of filtered in as we've been talking, myself and Mr. Grant here, we're dressed representing two of the four Shawnee men that were living with Lord Dunmore and his family in 1774 and 5, but we're not in character, right? So you're welcome to ask us about anything you might be interested in. Native folks here in Williamsburg, history, religions, social structure, family, gender roles, our own tribes that we come from. We're both citizens of federally recognized tribes. So whatever you might be curious about. Mm-hmm.
When you lived here with the governor, did you live as a domestic servant, or what were you doing?
No. So Native folks who travel in to deal with the governor are doing so because they're considered on the same social status as king and crown, right? And so they're here, these men are here as foreign ambassadors, right? So in 1774, Lord Dunmore goes out in the Ohio Valley after purchasing some land from Cherokee, right? To try and claim that territory, except Cherokee folks are not selling their territory to Lord Dunmore. They're selling Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte land to Lord Dunmore, right? So when he goes to claim that, he runs into those folks. And after a single battle at Point Pleasant, it's decided it's going to be too costly to pursue, right? But he does claim the point. Right. So the negotiations basically state to keep peace until a treaty can be signed the following spring, we'll exchange 4 of our English officers for 4 of your sons of headmen to come here to Williamsburg. So they get here on December 17th, 1774, and they're wine and dine. They're living in their palace with Lord Dunmore and his family. They're supping and dining with them. They're taking on carriage rides around the city. They're taken to the theater to see plays. They have suits given to them. They're taken out to Norfolk to see the ships and the ports. They're honored guests at the ball that Lady Dunmore holds here in January for the birth night of her daughter. So they're, just like any other Native delegate, they're at the very tippy top of English social structure.
Right? So sovereignty was more recognized under British authority than later with the American colonies.
Yes. Yes, because later after the American Revolution, there starts to be a vast generalization of, so like here, like I was telling these folks, there's no such concept as the Indians in this time period, right? So England does business with Cherokees, with Creeks, with Shawnees, and Wyandottes, and all these different tribes as their own independent countries. The Americans, because they're kind of short on time and resources, need to expedite that process. They don't have the ability to negotiate like England did, right? So now it's the Indians, the Indian Relocation Act, the Indian Removal Act, the Indian Citizenship Act, the Indian Voting Rights Act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Indian vote. So it's all based on the United States concept and definition of what they create as the Indian, right? And so that brings us into kind of the fold of American notions and society as people of color, which means we get the same treatment as people of color under American society, right? So that's how that changes and functions. So,
Are there a lot of Shawnees still in this area?
Well, no, because Shawnee folks originally are not from this area. So these 4 Shawnee men who came to stay here in Williamsburg live about 560 miles west of here. Shawnee territory extends from the south of the Great Lakes into the Ohio Valley, eastern Indiana, and northern Kentucky. That's Shawnee territory right there. And then in the 1800s, out to northeast Oklahoma. So,
And so they were part of that Supreme Court ruling lately that they still are in charge of half of Oklahoma?
Yes, McGirt v. Oklahoma. And so, yeah, so like, that territory was never taken out of reservation status by Congress. And the states have gotten into a very bad habit of things like state-recognized tribes and doing things on a state level, but tribes do not exist on a state level, right? We're a part of the federal government, and so States do not have the right to govern or lay taxes or any sort of regulations in native territories because they're not part of the state, right? So the state of Oklahoma actually looks very different from what people think it looks like, as do most states. And so, just like in the colonial time, they can draw their maps however they want. So if you've ever seen that the map of the colonies that like extends indefinitely westward, that's illegal. That's not true at all. The hard boundary of the colonies is at the Allegheny Mountains. In 1763, the king sets that boundary and says, none of my subjects are to settle west for the protection of Indian allies and their lands. But that map is more so propaganda than it is anything else, right? Just like with the maps in the United States today. People are familiar with the shapes of states, but legally, that's not true. That's not how they function. They don't govern that territory. 52% of Oklahoma belongs to the tribes who live in that territory. And so things like major crimes, taxes and regulations and things like that all belong to the tribes and their infrastructure.
So I was curious, like, how did some of the societal roles of men and women in like the Shawnee tribes change with the English arrival, or did they tend to stay, what they had been before?
Socially, so things do change. We do know that like pretty consistently, but at least for like my own people, there's actually a very big push. Oh my goodness. There's a very big push to reject European influence. That's like Tecumseh, his brother, things like that, up to the War of 1812, and then shortly after that, we get moved down to Oklahoma. So there's a very consistent push, like even in the 18th century, Shawnee folks are known to not be very fond of Virginians because of their social customs and things like that. And English people in particular. The French are a little bit different. So it's different for every community, and it's even to that degree, it's different for every individual, right? So historically, the way that our communities are run, matriarchal, matrilineal society, women own all the homes and property, they run families, they pass down the bloodlines, they're in charge of a lot of the internal government and things like that. That's all that. So they own all of that stuff. Men are in charge and own very, very little. So mainly external things. So hunting, fishing, fighting, playing stickball, going to war, trading and traveling between other nations. That's all kind of the realm of men. Especially after the American Revolution, with the American Civilization Act, they set out some criteria and say, all right, if you want to have a relationship like you had with England, here's some things you got to do, right? So it's another way of kind of whittling down the pool of people they have to work with, right? So you have to build these types of homes, you have to grow these types of crops. You can no longer have women do these things. Now men do these things. Men are the heads of the families and households now. And then of course like citizens, right? So women and children can't vote anymore. And you think about people within our communities who may be black or white or come from all over the places in the world, right? The United States says you can't, if you're going to be equal to us, you can't also be equal to them, right? So citizens of our nation who are black, the United States says that's not going to fly, right? So remember those crops and things we talked about? Now you take them and you put them to work out in those fields. Some tribes adopt those things pretty much regularly. So the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Weechees, and Seminoles, they're called the 5 civilized tribes by the United States because they adopt all of those criteria. So they start to become more patriarchal. They reformulate their constitutions. They start keeping enslaved people. They make men the heads of households instead of the women, right? Which overturns tens of thousands of years of society and cultural norms within the span of about 30 to 40 years. But I would note that Shawnee people are pretty resistant to those changes. So especially with Tecumseh, the brother, the Blue Jacket, and the folks that are militarily opposed to that change, right? So, no, we're not going to make men the heads of households. We're not going to keep enslaved people. We're not going to do those things. We don't want to be like Americans, right? And so, yeah, so that's kind of where those things start to come into play. After Tecumseh and his brother died, the last kind of remaining portions of our government cede territory in Indiana and start to begin the process of removal out to Kansas, originally in the northeast Oklahoma and Arkansas. But everybody's going to have different concepts of it. Most tribes in the Eastern Woodlands fall into what we call the Big Three: agricultural, democratic, and matriarchal matrilineal, right? So agriculture makes up 80% or more of our diets, either democratic governments like Cherokees, Creeks, and such, or republics like Shawnees, Wyandots, Six Nations, Delawares, and of course matriarchal matrilineal. Women own all property, women are the heads of households, women run a lot of government, women are the heads of families and bloodlines. So that all is kind of in direct conflict with the people we're dealing with, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a pretty heavy amount of friction in that realm. Into today, I would say, the last, if I remember correctly, so like to give a good example of how we kind of held on to that. Today, like our current Chief Glenna, she's been our chief now for close to, I want to say, 10, 15 years. I think the last report that I saw, social report that I saw from the tribe, about 60% of our households are ran by women. I think when it comes to our business stuff, I want to say it was about 3/4 of our business, small business grants and loans and things like that, and entrepreneurial funds were going to females. So today, socially, even though legally the United States doesn't allow it, socially, women are still dominant, I would say, within our society, right? So they're the head of our families, they run most of our homes, they're getting most of our money for small businesses and things like that. So it's the exact opposite of the United States.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.